All right, there we go.
That'll work.
Yeah.
That will work.
So, first off, some introductions. Marilyn Walton is someone who supports our show and what we're doing. And so my name is Tony Lupo, and this is
I'm Ryan Fairfield. Nice to meet you, sir.
and
Nice to meet you, Ryan.
Yeah, and we have a podcast called The Warrior Next Door, and it's based off interviews that Ryan and I have conducted for the past 20 years as volunteers for the Library of Congress. We've collected hundreds of interviews and sent them there with the hopes that someday they may be used or referenced by people like you, Donald. And so we really appreciate having you on our show. And I was wondering if you had any questions for us before we kind of dove into the interview.
What lake's that behind you?
So this was in a trip to Maine. This is at Acadia Peak, and so out in the Arcadian Acadia National Park. And this is a view from me and a couple of my friends hiking up there, and just taking some beautiful views from all the lakes in that area.
It's great. Yeah.
It is. I take it you've been there a few times?
No, but I've been fishing in Canada a few times. Not always successful. We go up for pike and bass and whatever,
I think our next trip we want to go
on the Rideau Canal system,
Okay.
Yeah.
I think our next trip we'd like to go up to like the Bay of Fundy and hike around that area along the coast. But I'm based out of Denver and Ryan's based out of Tulsa, but we meet all the time. We're best friends, and we often go to his recording studio, which you can see in the background there, to conduct the podcast, or we can do it remotely like we are right now. And man, I've been such a big fan of yours. Here's one of the books, The Story of World War II. We got Masters of the Air. And I think one of the things that, and we'll get to it later, is just the masterful way that you bring in these oral histories. And again, for Ryan and I, that's important because we like to think that we're recording these for people, that someone's using them, and you do. But if you don't mind, I'd like to just start off with a simple, basic question you've asked a million times. You have Masters of the Air, this amazing opus that you've written. It's going to be launched on January 26th on Apple TV as a miniseries, another Spielberg and Hanks production. Could you tell us what gave you the idea or the impetus or the motivation to write this book to begin with?
Well, I didn't write it for the series, that's for sure. The call to make it part of the series came out of the blue from Steven Spielberg. And but way back when, if you go back to a little biography here, if you go back to the story of World War II, which was my first World War II book, I hadn't written a book on World War II up till then. I'd written 6 books. It wasn't that I was uninterested in the war. I grew up in a war family, if you will. My father served in the Air Force, and my uncle was with the Big Red One. He was in the first 2 minutes of D-Day and the landings on Omaha Beach. And I had an uncle that flew the B-29s against Tokyo, and you name it. And so we had, their old army chests with their old uniforms and everything up in my grandma's attic, and we'd play with that as kids. And so it was always part of our lives. I grew up in a small working class neighborhood where pretty much everybody, mostly steel workers and coal miners, had served in the war. And it was a real part of our lives. My dad was president of the Catholic War Veterans, and not that there was a lot of talk about the war. They kept that talk largely to themselves, and so I didn't get a lot, from that. My uncle liked to talk about cutting off the ears of Moroccans, but that was about it. And how he hated George Patton and how he hated the Red Cross, because their troop ship from Africa to England, where they were going to train for the invasion, sunk, and the Red Cross, when they pulled him out of the drink, charged him a nickel for a coffee. And he never forgot that. That's you mentioned World War II, and he'd start talking about the Red Cross. And, but anyway, when my father passed away in '96, I really started to think a lot, especially at his funeral, about how I had really missed an opportunity to write a book that would really absorb me. And I was living in Easton, Pennsylvania, and we're not far. Right down the hill here is where Lou Rita's studios. You know Lou at all? He's a documentarian.
Mhm.
I do.
And Lou said, "Come on down to the studio. I got some really interesting guys down here, and one of them in particular will interest you." And that was Eugene Sledge.
Oh
Oh,
That's when I met Sledge, along with he'd come up with Ron Pascal and Joe Alexander. And wow, I thought, this is sensational. And he gave a 2-day interview that was mind blowing. And that got me going. That got me thinking about using oral histories, and maybe Henry Steele Commager had a book that was on Lou's desk, about the war that he wrote during the war. So it couldn't be a complete history. But I like the title, The Story of World War II, although it really wasn't Commager's book. I don't know how the hell he got on the title, but anyway, we used the title, but we didn't use just about anything from Commager. And I interviewed airmen in that, and the air war has a real pull to it because it's so different, air combat from ground combat, in ways that are obvious, but other ways that are less obvious and that are crucially important in terms of how men fight and how they can fight and how they survive. So I did that book. I thought it was my way of teaching myself World War II history, if you will. And I thought I'd do it. I'd never done a book using a lot of oral history testimonies. And I thought, although I had used oral histories in other books, but not quite in that way. And I liked the way it turned out, the immediacy of the impressions of the guys. And I thought the key is, how do you integrate narrative history with oral history in a seamless fashion, so that the transition to the interview isn't jarring, but is consonant, with the narrative you're spitting out, and really worked hard on doing that. I think my work as a newspaper reporter for the Washington Post helped. We always used a lot of quotes, and Ben Bradley was the editor then, and those were the Watergate days, and he stressed that. He said, you got to get people speaking in these stories, or people aren't going to believe the story. It gives the story veracity. And so I started working on that idea of bringing the person who you're writing about forward, rather than the author forward. And so I've been working on that ever since. That was a good start, a training ground and that sort of thing, and used the concept in Masters of the Air. Masters was not that hard to do in a sense of collecting the material, because of Maxwell Field and the archives down there. I mean, they're tremendous oral histories down there. And in addition, the Library of Congress, of course, is a great source. And I was living in Washington, D.C., of course, the nexus, of American history, and easy access to this sort of stuff. And began to interview veterans at the University of Maryland as well, who were on the faculty. And so that's kind of how it started. And then I decided to do the book after I read a piece by a guy named Grinker, and it's in my bibliography, and Men Under Stress. And it's not the kind of book that a layman would pick up and sit down and read and for enjoyment or anything else. Grinker was an Air Force psychologist during the war. He flew with the men because he needed to understand them. And to understand their trauma, he had to see it exhibiting itself in the planes and the kind of things that precipitated it. So he has this case study after case study of airmen who either broke down in combat or broke down in combat and they were able to bring them around and get them up again as flyers, or were completely unsuccessful, which was the case with a lot of the guys, as Grinker admits. And largely, he said, kind of, the effort was a failure. I mean, it was so difficult to have them overcome the traumas, the deep kind of traumas that they were experiencing, which he thought he had done some work in North Africa. And he said, the combat vets down there, and there was a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder down there. It wasn't called that then. Combat fatigue was the word. And he had worked with those guys after Kasserine Pass. And when he started working with the airmen, he said, my God, it's very different. Those guys wear down. And he uses the word like an army truck. You can get about 50,000 miles out of it. You can only get so many days out of a combat veteran. And at the same time, I was reading The Anatomy of Courage by Winston Churchill's, it was Winston Churchill's doctor and Lord Moran. And he had served in World War I as a combat officer on the front line, and as what was then called a psychiatric officer. And he handled these kind of problems. And he makes the point about courage, for example. He gets into fear as well as courage. Those are the two main themes that he deals with. That, the average guy only has so much courage. It's like a bank deposit. I mentioned this in the story of World War II. And I mentioned this in Masters of the Air. And when you use it up, you're done. You become kind of a rag man, incapable of functioning properly in combat. And he said with airmen, the precipitant is usually it cannot be only one, it can be as few as one traumatic incident, one overwhelmingly mental shakeup, and that can trigger this. And the way you exhibit it is a little bit different than a combat guy might just go absolutely crazy and be maybe manning an artillery station and run out in the field right into German fire and start picking flowers or something. He did something absolutely whacked out and really needed a lot of help. With an airman, they got catatonic a lot, and they froze up, and they experienced traumas and physical afflictions that are a lot like Parkinson's disease, the shakes and things like that. So you could watch for this really closely. And Grinker points out, along with some other, I've read a lot of combat surgeons on the war, some of the reports. Maxwell, the archives are replete with these reports, how the combat surgeon, like at 12 o'clock high, if you recall, would go to the bar and watch the guys, and see if they're a little jumpy, maybe they're over aggressive, physically, sexually, maybe there's a shooting incident on the base. There's ways that you can almost see this sort of stuff that a guy's kind of unraveling, and it happens pretty quickly. So I almost thought of I got so far into that stuff psychically that I almost thought of doing the whole book on fear and courage, but decided not to. And the I was talking to early on at the time I was doing this. I'm just recalling this now when I met Robert Rosenthal, and I met him down at Savannah. He was there with his whole family, and I was just at the point where I was starting to think about writing a book about the air war. It's a big investment because you're thinking about years of your life. And I like to write, not necessarily long books, but I'd like to write complete books. And the stuff I was reading on the Air Force was unsatisfying to me because there was a lot of shoot 'em up stuff. And some of them were just dealt with the home front in England. But very rarely and I didn't find one, did you find a book that dealt with the whole panoply of issues that airmen deal with: escape and evasion, the Stalag experience, interrogation by the Germans, life in the English villages, visits to London, relationships with British airmen, all that sort of stuff. And I thought, if I'm going to write something complete like that, I better have a really good story. And talking to Rosenthal, was the key, because he had a hell of a story to tell, as you guys know. And when I was talking about the trauma and everything, he goes, "Don, it happened. And it happened more than I'd like to say, but it didn't always happen. And it didn't mostly happen, and isn't most of the story. And I think you might be on the wrong track there if you're thinking that this is representative of the whole experience." And he said, "I gather you're trying to write a book that's representative, holistic of the whole experience." And I said, "Well, I am." And he said, "Do the whole thing and make this part of it, And I thought, yeah, that's what I should do.
How long did it take you to write this book, Donald? I mean, you just kind of passed through.
I got a little timer in there that I'm not aware of. You see, I can't write anything less than a 400-page book, which is ridiculous. And I always tell my editor, every contract I have lists a shorter book. And every time I get to the finish line, my editor says, "Oh, okay, we'll do it." And it's pretty good. So I'm struggling with that problem now. My next Civil War book on Lincoln and Grant in the last year of the war. Two big figures, if you will.
Yeah.
And I always seem to take big subjects. And I said, why did I get overwhelmed like this? My God, why did you take one of Grant's aides, Rawlins or somebody, and just do Grant through Rawlins or something like that? Why the hell did you have to take on this whole thing, And then you're kind of stuck. You got to finish it. Yeah.
Well, I've got a question real quick for you. I guess kind of more of a statement in support of you writing a book about, fear and courage, because, as Tony and I have interviewed veterans over the last 20 years, we always marvel at how these guys are able to do their job in the face of daunting odds, basically putting their fear behind them. And sometimes they can't, and just yesterday we were able to interview, two separate Medal of Honor recipients. Each one has his own amazing story, but these stories of courage go from the general all the way down, of course, to the private. And
yeah,
it's truly amazing the way that these men, they say that it comes from their training first and foremost, but it seems to me like it's also part of your genetics in a way. What are your thoughts on these guys being able to put aside, freezing in the battlefield, and doing their job heroically?
Yeah, I don't know about the genetics thing. I mean, the British certainly believe that. I mean, um, they called it lack of moral courage, and that's a tough term to label a guy, you know. And they do claim their in their analysis of their programs that if a guy breaks down, it was our fault, the fault of the testers. He slipped through the cracks. We're looking for certain rock solid characters that won't be susceptible to this, that have the mental stability and courage to hold up under these kinds of strains, and that there are human beings who just don't. I don't know about that one. I tend more to Warren's point that it can happen to anybody. Certainly, Audie Murphy, you know, argues that same point. A lot of guys I read, I really think it's the pressure, the kind of pressure you're exposed to. It's kind of like in Masters of the Air. Not a lot of reviewers paid attention to what I thought was the best part of the book, and that was the German reaction to the bombing. And the bombing, to put it in short form, did break morale. It really did. I mean, if you go into a city like Cologne that gets hit 147 times during the war, it's going to be different than being in a British city like Coventry that maybe takes 6 hits. And the susceptibility to break down morale is much greater the more bombs you pound people with. And I just think the Germans really got pounded, in the war. But see, the thing about morale bombing, which the British were transfixed by, is it's crazy to believe, I think, in morale bombing, because even though you break morale, it doesn't matter. If you're living in a police state, what good is a breakdown in morale? And what the Strategic Bomb Survey, an underrated survey, by the way, I think, very good survey, what their people found is that when morale started to break, what set in was indifference. That indifference in a sense of not apathy, but closing yourself off to everything but survival, and the survival of you and your family. And loyalty to the Fuhrer dropped off. Attendance at Nazi party meetings dropped off. It's just you fall into a state often of, and it happens a lot with children, of listlessness, and you don't exactly want to call it apathy, but you certainly aren't going to turn. Bombing's not going to turn you into a revolutionary. It oppresses with a capital O. It beats down on you, and exhibits your helplessness. So I think they were barking up the wrong tree with that morale bombing stuff. It worked, but it didn't matter.
So you make that distinction really clear in the book between the two different philosophies of the air war, between the British and Bomber Harris and the United States. And in fact, you start the book off. If I could break the book into 4 big components, and there's a lot more to it than that, obviously.
Do it. I can't.
I'll for me, the points that were really reinforced is the bomber mafia's grip on strategy and tactics and missed opportunities, and then on the hellish conditions of the fighters, not of the bombers, and also not just the bombers with the Luftwaffe and the flak, but the weather. The weather is a reoccurring theme. And so that's 3. And then the 4th one is just the dominance that the United States and Britain had during the war. And you speak a lot into this idea that the United States and the bomber mafia wanted to do the type of bombing that would go after targets that would stop the war machine, whether it was ball bearings, oil, railways, and that the British they just wanted to bomb everyone out because they felt like what you were just saying, that they could defeat the morale and the will to fight. And I just thought that it was I thought it was really interesting how you spent a lot of time on that. It's like you felt you weren't just being a historian in the sense that you were accumulating this information and sharing it with us, but it's almost like you had an epiphany and you wanted to make sure that the reader understood there was a difference all the way through the end of the war.
Yeah, I really did get kind of evangelical there, pressing the point, because it was so ignored, and
Yes.
I wanted to really emphatically make the point that I was making about the difference, because I was so impressed with the minutes from the air commanders conferences. Every month, the Allied air commanders would meet somewhere in the ETO, and invariably, in the middle of 44, 45, there were these huge arguments captured on paper, and well, I don't get that. Yeah, you're still there. Yeah,
Yes, we are.
There were these huge debates about arguments, not debates. Everybody was on Harris about the wastefulness of what he was doing, especially Doolittle, who really saw that the bombing was starting to take hold when they went after those marshalling yards. And he needed help, all the help he could get. And he pressed Portal to press Harris or somebody to enter this and get Harris to do. Harris did do a lot of what we call strategic bombing, but not nearly enough. And the air commanders keep saying, look, they still have a lot of powder in the barrel. They have, they're making submarines with snorkels, and they're manufacturing jets, and who knows how successful their synthetic oil program was. Interestingly, embedded in the strategic air survey is a booklet on synthetic oil, and these American oil scientists and experts from the big companies like Exxon, they were convinced that the Germans could have made through the Burgess process, could have made oil successfully underground in the way they were making planes. Ventilation was the problem, and they thought they had that problem solved. And they really were afraid of that. And it was Hitler who opposed that program. He thought it was wasteful, and he wanted to just do, retaliatory bombing. But if the Germans had pushed that oil program and pushed their power program, they also had a group within their target analyst groups that wanted to go after the grid, the electric grids and things like that in England. And that didn't happen either. Maybe, they could have been successful in knocking that out and helping to prepare the way for the invasion. So, the strategic bombing survey is filled with all kinds of interesting arguments, internal arguments that were taking place in the high command about how to beat the Germans, and how to, don't forget, it's a question of celerity. It's a question of how fast you can do it, because we've got a war to fight in the Pacific. So there's always that pressure. So sometimes a good idea would pop up, like hitting the electrical system. And Spot said, we don't have time to do it. It's hard to find. It's hard to hit. And we're better off sticking with these gigantic oil plants, and starting with Presti and going to Leuna and whatnot, and going after the marshalling yards and the canals and the rail systems, not bombing the railways themselves, but bombing railheads and things like that. So time is ever on their minds. In a way, we have to put ourselves, I think, in all history, behind the eyes of the people who make the decisions, at the point that they make the decisions, as obvious as that sounds. Otherwise, everything is deterministic. If you write a history of World War II and you make it known that, everybody knows the Allies win, and your idea is to show how they won, well, frankly, they could have lost. So it's kind of a false history if you're doing it chronologically, because for long periods of time, especially in the air war, they are losing. So better to do it day to day, year to year, as an unfolding drama, because we don't know ourselves what's going to happen in the next 5 minutes. And they didn't either. And we have to see the war as they saw it. And what seems so often to be foolish made some sense at the time. So I always try to keep that in mind. I call it the fallacy of hindsight.
Yes.
Of relying too much on hindsight,
And is it fair to say, Donald, that because you do use oral histories from that period exhaustively in your book, that keeps you from being, that kind of allows you to capture that zeitgeist better, as opposed to doing
I think so. Letters are even better.
Okay.
Because letters are written at the time. And say Sledge's letters from Okinawa or something like that. I mean, there you have the immediacy. I find that with the Civil War especially. Civil War soldiers were letter writers much more than World War II soldiers. But the further away they write about the war, and their account of the war becomes a memoir from the distance of 30 years, say. Like Grant's, for example, you can capture a lot through perspective, which hindsight does give you, but you can lose a lot of immediacy and of situations at the time. Like Albert Speer, kind of making fun, mocking in his autobiography, the American, what he calls decision. It wasn't a decision. I'll explain that in a second. After Regensburg and Schweinfurt, he said, if the Americans and the Brits had gone back and pounded those targets incessantly throughout late August and into September, they might have driven us out of the war. But what he doesn't realize is we didn't have, we didn't have the power to do that. We didn't have the planes, and we didn't have the pilots. We didn't have the crews. It was it was a very small Air Force at the time. I mean, you couldn't mount 1,000 mission bombers, 1,000 mission raids, and things like that. And it was why Aker was against Regensburg Schweinfurt. He just didn't think we were ready to take a beating where you could lose up to a third, which is what they did. You lose up to a third of your force, and then you're knocked out for about 3 or 4 weeks in terms of doing some massive bombing, which they finally get back to at Stuttgart and then into Marienburg and places like that in October. But yeah, you have to see it from the perspective of the people who are making the decisions. Yeah.
Were those Schweinfurt raid? Was that Schweinfurt raid though before we had fighter escorts, where we were therefore we were taking heavier, much heavier?
Absolutely, absolutely. But Aker, when you read his letters and stuff, he's not that. He's irritatingly oblivious, not oblivious, but
can I add something really quick, Donald?
Yeah.
I think maybe the word you're looking for, because I was going to bring this up before Ryan's question as well. It feels like the bomber mafia had these huge blind spots.
Yeah.
I mean, they couldn't see that you needed these things.
Typical doctrinaires, I mean, the way politics has become doctrinaire today, where there's no debate about it. And it's this way or that way. And they were so invested in that. And Arnold was so afraid of getting folded up into the RAF and not getting what he wanted, a separate Air Force after the war. They were crazy about that. They just, boy.
I mean, I mean, just to me, some of the things that you reinforced in the book with the bomber mafia mentality of precise strikes during the day on targets that would cripple the military is they seem to always have this blind spot where they felt like the bombers didn't need escorts, and they did, and it just seemed like they had an over abundance of optimism on what they thought the capabilities actually were, and then they had to deal with the weather. And then you write that it prevented them from taking on targets that really mattered until pretty late in the war. I mean, I thought you did a really good job of that. There were times when you would talk about the bomber mafia philosophy that prevented us from really facing reality. And as a reader, I was getting frustrated. I was yelling at the book. I was like, come on, guys, can't you see you need a long range fighter? I mean, was that deliberate when you were putting it in there? Did you feel that frustration as well when you read these notes?
I did feel it. And there were a number of Air Force officers inside the war. When everything kind of broke down at San Nazar and places like that, and they're just not able to knock out those sub-10s. I mean, all you have to do is visit San Nazar today and see the reinforced concrete. If the Germans did anything well, it was reinforced concrete.
Yeah, for sure.
In fact, when we went to San Nazar with a bunch of people, I talked to the guide. I said a couple things. One, there's no visitors here. He said, no, only the Germans come. And and he said, secondly, I said, what's second? He said, they marvel at the concrete. They think this is great. We did a hell of it. It's like, he said, for some of them, it's like, especially the engineers, we won the war. They couldn't knock this place out, with the Atlantic Wall, which we never really defeated.
Yeah. Instead of, like you write in the book, going after things like oil and transportation and sort of things that were soft spots for them. I mean, I had a chance to listen to you share some of your experiences on the Veterans Breakfast Club about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And I was the guy that asked the question about the oil plan. Why did it take so long? And I want to add something to that really quick, Donald. I had not read Masters of the Air when I asked that question. Mm-hmm. And when I asked you that question, you were kind of like, you literally said, well, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? And now that I've read your book, I understand there was no single answer for why that didn't happen. It was way more complex than that.
Yeah, it is. It's the complexity of it that comes across, and there's all sorts of cross currents that are operating on these air commanders. I mean, right after D-Day, they're forced into what, as you guys know, is called crossbow. Mm-hmm. Well, because England's getting hammered with V1s and V2, actually V1s, V2s, and so something had to be done about that. And so, just as Spots finds what he thinks is the soft spot, the Achilles heel, he's got to divert, would be his word, a lot of force to these rocket sites. And Churchill's saying, my God, of course you got to do that. Look what they're doing to our cities. And what if they developed this gigantic New York rocket and things like that? I mean, so what if they have an atomic bomb program, which we didn't know then? We don't know that until we get to Cologne and send interrogators across the border and get into chemical labs and facilities that, that they were about 9 to 10 months behind us, at least in the atomic program, in their absence of heavy water and whatnot. But yeah, there's all these sorts of things that come into the equation. The Air Force just gets started, and all of a sudden, well, we're going into North Africa, and there goes 40% of the Air Force down to North Africa. Mm-hmm. And there goes the whole dream of early strategic bombing. And so they never really got the force structure that they wanted until early 44, when they started flying those gigantic, what Sonny Reston in the New York Times called flying artillery raids when they could mount 1,300 bombers on a mission.
And that's another element in your book that you address towards the end, that about the dominance, that we finally got that. I'd like to just read something from your book really quick, if you don't mind. It talks to basically the dominance. You write that by the end of 1944, almost 4/5 of German towns and over 100,000 inhabitants had already been destroyed. Allied bombing operations had peaked. In the first 4 months of 1945, the American forces dropped over twice the tonnage of bombs on Germany that the RAF had dropped in all of 1943 in the first 4 months. But this to me, this next sentence is where I think you excel as a historian, because you could have just stopped that paragraph right there. People have been like, wow, we were pretty amazing. But then you continue with a quote: "It is soul destroying to wait day and night for the inevitable disaster," said 68-year-old Matilde Wolf Monckeberg, wrote to her grown children who were living outside the Reich. This German matron refused to leave her poor, burning, destroyed Hamburg town when mass evacuations occurred. What I think you do so well is you state a fact, which is already amazing, and you just reinforced it with a German citizen who was on the ground that felt those sort of bombings. How do you find these sources in places like Germany or Switzerland or whatnot to help reinforce these stories? Where do you get those?
Yeah, that's the key to the books. It just it's a simple answer, Tony. It's doing the extra 9 yards of research and researching things that you not at the time think. You might think, well, this is wasting time. I got to get on with the story, but it's really interesting stuff. So I tend to stop myself and file. I have a good filing system, and
I was going to ask you about that. How do you keep track of all these?
Yeah, I really, I'm a disorganized person ordinarily, as my wife will tell you. But I just got a lecture right before this. But anyway, you really have to keep things in. I don't feel good about a chapter so much when I finish it. I feel really good about a chapter when it's organized and ready. I'm ready to write it. When I have it set up in the file drawer exactly the way I want to tell it. Now, I'll deviate from that, of course, when I write and go in different directions. But the settled notion that gives you, the sense of like, I got this. I know what happened. And importantly, I know how to tell the story. There's a way of telling this story that is unique and that is interesting. And I always put on top of the chapter, will the reader turn the next page? And got that idea from reading Barbara Tuchman. And that is the idea, the unrolling of the story. And that's the secret too, to another one of the more difficult things about writing narrative history. And that is, how do you incorporate interpretation into narration without slowing the narration and making it really soupy? Here also, I think Tuchman provides some good ideas. Just tell the story as it happened. And the interpretation will kind of creep up on you and tap you on the shoulder and say, here I am. The interpretation's in the story. If the story's told right, you get all the facts right. You get all the controversy in there, the debates and things like that. And you'll see that you're writing from a point of view. The way you organize a book is an act of interpretation. You understand? I think that's really important, that you don't have to say, I believe this in declamatory prose or anything like that. But the way you organize it is an interpretation. And
Is your background, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just wanted to ask you, is your background primarily in history or in writing? Because you strike me as someone who was academically trained to be a writer, but you're a historian and you teach history. How has that worked for you? I mean, how did you get your
I would
training?
say I was more oriented toward writing. And I went to a small Benedictine college called St. Vincent College. It was a really nice school for me because I wasn't ready for anything bigger than that. And I had some great instructors, and I was drawn to philosophy, actually. And my favorite subject was logic and putting things together. I loved it. I got my highest grades in logic. I really concentrated on it, and I carried that over into organizing papers and things like that. I could, with my unconsciously almost, with my philosophy background, I was organizing things much better. And I could see that I was doing that. And so that was really important to me. Outlining was hugely important to me.
Yeah.
You know,
Allows you to structure your thoughts.
Well, I was afraid when I started writing because I didn't have much confidence. As a high school student, I was an athlete more than a student. And when I went to college, I was pretty much of an asshole. And and I got straightened out pretty fast by a guy who was a very good athlete himself, who happened to be my history teacher. And the kind of history teacher who didn't lecture and things, but just discussed history and sent you to the library and things like that, and told you you're gonna get smarter by reading, and you better start right now because you're behind. You're way behind, buddy. And I remember sitting at a bar in Greensburg, Pennsylvania, with a buddy of mine, and we were just getting into being young intellectuals. And I turned to him and I said, John, what are we going to do when we have finished reading all the good books? you talk about pretension. You talk about two sober at the time, two absolute idiots.
Well, then you write your own awesome books, right?
I'll never forget that conversation. And he, who was as stupid as I was, looked at me and he said, "Yeah, I think of that all the time." What are we going to do when we run out of books?
well, Donald, I think that's a great segue, because here you are talking about the early version of you, who was, maybe had some confidence issues, wasn't sure you're going to become a good writer. And now you are days away from having one of your books featured on a Steven Spielberg, Tom Hanks collaboration. Could you tell our audience how an author gets approached to have their book become a huge miniseries on Apple TV? How does that work? What does that look like?
I don't know. I really don't know. I really don't know.
I really don't know.
Yeah. I am running out of power, and I have it plugged in, and I don't know what the heck is going on here. It says I have 10%, and yeah, battery life. But I just changed it. Let me.
Sure, go ahead, take the time you need.
Yeah, we sure hate to lose you at this point.
Yeah. Yeah, something's wrong with this outlet. Hold on, let me find another
Sure
outlet.
thing, no worries.
Take your time.
Walk this thing into another room.
Okay.
I didn't see that going down like that. Hold on.
Yep.
Okay. I should have noticed that light didn't go off.
Hey, we're getting a nice tour of your house. This is great.
Yeah, exactly.
Got some pictures there. That's fantastic.
Yeah. Let's see if this one works. About the bar here.
Oh, that's even better. Now we know why your power went out. You wanted to go get a drink.
Yeah.
You're stressing
that-
out too much, Tony.
I think that's it. I think we got the right one. Yeah. 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 That's better.
All right, we'll make sure we cut
But
all that.
in answer to your question, I don't
Yeah.
know. I mean, you keep plugging away, and Dave McCullough, who was a very close friend of mine, he kept telling me that my books did have cinematic potential, but I kind of got the taste for it when the American Experience made a television series out of my Chicago book, and that was big. And then Lou Rita and the History Channel and other channels started to make short features, an hour and things like that, and did a show on Night of the Long Knives. And we did, before this, we did a film called The Air War, which is a really good film, I think, and it's about the 100th Bomb Group. So I was confident I could do it, and I was glad for the opportunity. I just needed to be close to people who believed in me, propinquity, as they say, I mean, just being in the right spot, It's fortunate. I owe that to the World War II Museum, because I was very close friends with Stephen Ambrose, and Steve and I both published with Simon and Schuster. And one day Steve said, "Hey, I'm opening a museum." I said, "You got to be kidding me." And because he was the most disorganized guy in the world. But he had a guy named Nick Mueller who was unbelievably organized and a real businessman as well as an historian. And so I went down to the opening, and I met Hanks and Spielberg there, and a lot of other people, and I got associated with the museum. Steve brought me in as a consultant, and met other historians, and widened my range and things like that. Put me around a really good group of people, and so that placed me in a position, at least, to meet people like Hanks and Spielberg. Yeah.
But did they like send you an email someday saying, "Hey, let's get the band back together"? I mean, what does it look like? You are an accomplished writer in your own right, a New York Times bestseller. And I've watched some of the other movies that are based on work you've done. So you're already a thing. But it's kind of like, holy crap. I mean, Steven Spielberg's a thing as well. What was it like when in a movable force?
Well, yeah, I don't know exactly. I remember getting a phone call one time from Playtone Studios, and there's a guy there named Kurt Sadusky who kind of runs the place. And McCullough was down there. They were going to make a film of his book on the early days of the American Revolution in Boston Harbor. And McCullough put Kurt on the phone and told him that, he really ought to be working with me. And Kurt said, "I've read all his books, and the time is going to come." And then when they started the Pacific, I was really occupied with a lot of stuff, family stuff, and sickness in the family. And then when they got along, Tom called me, Hanks called me and said, "We're having a problem with this Pacific thing. The individual parts are really good, but the connectives are sometimes missing. How do you get the reader from Guadalcanal to Gloucester and on to Okinawa or from Iwo Jima to Okinawa. That's hard for the reader to fathom because the war is so vast geographically and things like that. And how do you make the connections? And I said, yeah, it is a problem. And I done a book called D-Days in the Pacific. And he said, well, come on down here and help us. And so that's how I got started, working with them on connecting all of the various parts of the puzzle. And they'd send up to Easton. I didn't have to travel much. They'd send up to Easton, almost a guy who was like a stenographer. And we'd sit for hours and he'd take notes and I'd kind of muse about how to do things. And then we'd have long conversations with the writers and the producers. And that was when I really started to get into it. And then after that, we started to make a film that was going to showcase the museum. This was after we suffered a horrible hurricane in New Orleans, Katrina, and and almost went under. And we're looking for a way to pull ourselves back up. And Nick Mueller decided to gamble big time. And Nick is really the star of the show. And he said, we're going to go big. We're going to build a theater and we're going to do a tremendous film, unlike any that had been done before, in a multiplex theater and using the Disney company. And we're going to raise the money and pull it off. And we did. And I got involved in that. And a lot of our work took us to California, where the Disney studios were, because we had some moving parts, seats that shook and, fake snow and all this other stuff. And Hanks was the advisor on the film. And he really helped us a lot. It wasn't just, him coming in and taking a quick look at things. I mean, he would come in and critique it and things like that. And he mentioned to me there that, he'd like to work with me, and that he was thinking up the line of something along the lines of, as he put it at the time, his dad was in the Navy. He said, my dad hated the Navy, but I still like to do the Navy. But, he was thinking of the tin can soldiers and maybe combine that with the Air Force. But then how do you connect them? And I said, you don't connect them. That's too much of a stretch and things like that. And that's where we left it. And then one day I got the call. And so he said, we're going to do it just on the Air Force. And I was told later by Kurt Sadusky that they were all sitting around one day talking about this very thing, what exactly to do, when Spielberg walked in with my book and said, this is the book we're going to do.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. Oh. So that was it. And he's the boss. So yeah. That's the story that I heard, and I believe it.
What's it like working? Go ahead, Ryan.
Well, real quick, I was just going to say, there's Band of Brothers, which is something that has become a hugely impactful miniseries. Yeah. Some people, with the timing of it being released right around September 11th, 2001, a lot of people, I think, really looked at that miniseries as a huge boost of patriotism, and it brought a lot of people back to the history of World War II.
It did, yeah.
And then you go from the European theater to the Pacific with the miniseries of Pacific, and now the Air War. Your book being one of the trilogy so far, hopefully there's more of these that Hanks and Spielberg do. It has to be immensely, satisfying to know that you've been inducted into this this storyline, this narrative for our culture.
Yeah. Guys, I'm losing you again.
Okay.
I'm down to, something's going on here with my battery. I think I'm down to 5% again, so we'll have to.
Well,
sure.
Is there anything that you'd like to add about Masters of War for our audience that they should keep an eye on, or that you're particularly proud of when this mini series drops, and we can kind of leave it there?
Well, I think, it's fidelity. I think it's the whole idea of being true to the actual experience and not having to make things up.
Mm-hmm.
You have to place in your mind the idea that everything you're watching actually happened. That this is not a documentary, but at the same time, it's not a movie either. It's a movie that's really solidly based on documentary evidence, and there are very few movies exactly like that. At every turn, we made the decision to do it as it happened, to the exact character that it happened to. There are certain exceptions in there. One of the characters, Biddick, isn't a big character in my book. Some of the women aren't characters at all. There are little changes, but by and large, it's overwhelmingly true to the experience of the war, as close as we could pull it off.
Oh, that's great.
Well, I just signed up for HBO. I'm sorry, HBO, but Apple TV to be able to watch this. I know a lot of other people are.
Yeah.
You are immensely gracious for taking the time with us today.
It was a lot of fun. It was a good day. I got the new. We have a beautiful new cover on the book, and I got the book in the mail today. It's really pretty.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And I mean, I know that you're going to be really busy. You're inundated right now, I'm sure, with people that want to interview you and talk to you as this debut date approaches. But do you think maybe later this summer, when things are going, do you think we could kind of reconnect with you and maybe get your thoughts?
Hey, that'd be fun. That'd definitely be fun. Sure, let's do it.
That's fantastic.
All right, Donald. This is not
really enjoyed talking to you guys.
Well, same
I enjoyed talking with you as well.
This problem, either it's the cord or something.
Yeah.
Oh, we're going to send you a battery next time so it doesn't happen.
I'm noticing that the cord's a little frayed or something. I think
it may be that.
Yeah, your cat got after it, but we really appreciate this, and I'm going to be reaching out to you later to pester you again so we can
no
chat.
problem. It's not a pester at all.
Cool.
It's a great pre-dinner conversation.
Well, great.
Fantastic.
And the fact that we did it as a conversation was extra special, I thought.
Great. And that's how we like to do things. And not only that, our audience who loves these oral histories, you use them so masterfully. It's just fantastic. Can't wait to watch it next week. We're letting everyone we know, but we don't need to, because it's going to be a hit, and we can't wait to see it. And thank you again for the books that you write, and for this role, this new thing, this new canon that we'll have with the movies associated with World War II. So thank you, Donald. We appreciate it.
Yeah, and tell them that we're doing podcasts after every episode.
Oh, really?
I'm gonna be joining those, and we'll put those on our Facebook page and our website as well.
We have the actors, set directors, Hanks himself, Kurt Sadusky, and I host it. So we have that. And so, yeah, it's going to be great. Yeah.
We're planning on having Marilyn Walton back on our podcast. She was a guest host with us on a series we did. So anyway, she speaks very highly of you, and I can see why. You're a great guy. We appreciate your time.
Thanks, guys. Have a good evening.
Okay, you too.
I enjoyed this a lot. I really did.
All right.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
All right.